Good morning. Please turn with me to Matthew 1 as we look at the subject this morning, the kingdom, the kingdom, the kingdom. And as the scripture reading showed, we got basically, not even the summary, the very last words that Jesus spoke in the Sermon on the Mount, which is where this week's readings end. But if you click on the short lessons at all, you know they weren't so short this week. And I'm going to blame that on this being important subject matter. These are things I don't necessarily want to rush through because the fact that ultimately there's just a lot here. And so with that, I'm going to take the day, as I discussed with the elders before preaching today, and I'm pretty much going to preach the study guide. And so with that, you might not have a study guide with you. Even if you do, you know it's not the Bible. But we're still going to preach the Bible. I'm just going to structure it according to the study guide, because I'm hoping to point this lesson beyond the sermon to, God willing, some things that you will look at and consider maybe this week as you look at the beginning of the life of Jesus as we are starting out in the Gospels. It's fundamental for a reason. This is the way God chose to start it out, and I'm hoping as we start out the new covenant that you look at it. You take Jesus' life seriously, and then some of the nuances, hopefully, that I'm pointing out will just be a foundation for your study for this week. As we open the door to the Gospels in general, and I'm going to state, like I sometimes do, this is going to be a more, I want to call it opinionated, it's going to be a more subjective address than normal. And so I'm just going to do that because right now I'm kind of in a phase where I got some ideas about what I think I see, but I'm not sure they're true. So I just want to qualify that. I don't want to be encumbered by feeling like stumbling over every word and thinking it's not really what it said, but just be a Berean, as I've said recently, as much as you can. I'm just going to preach. And with that, the Gospel of Matthew in a lot of ways talks about the kingdom of God. If you just do a word search in your phone, on your favorite platform, I use Bible Gateway, you're going to see that outside of the Old Covenant, it's going to come up literally, the word king and kingdom, more in Matthew's gospel than anywhere else in the New Testament. That's not just words. In this gospel, he is talking a lot about the kingdom. It starts in chapter 1 when he is making his lineage relevant to David, one of the great kings, the first great king of Israel. Going on from there, he's going to talk about a lineage that ain't a lot to write home about. It said in the short lesson. He's not necessarily going to win anybody's popularity contest. But the thing that helped distinguish both he and David was the fact that in spite of their upbringing, there was something about them that made their skills stand out in a way that they don't necessarily stand out if you got all the advantages, right? And so one of the things that we hear in John's gospel is, can anything good come from Nazareth? And early on in Matthew's gospel, we realize that that's where he settled. It wasn't where he was born. He was born in Bethlehem. But when he settled down in a place where not a whole lot of people thought anything good could come out of that. And so understand in your life, there are times when you hear somebody's origin story. And one of the things that will catch your attention is if you know they came out of a situation, ain't a whole lot good usually comes out of that. There's a reason why Matthew starts out his gospel, out of all the places he could have made his lineage relative to, he could have started out with Adam. Adam's the first man, right? Why didn't he start there? He starts out by saying he's the son of David, a man who didn't have a tremendous reputation. How do you know? It's by the time you get to Saul wanting to give him his daughter in marriage, he's like, who am I, a poor man, and who is my family? A man of not much reputation, that I should be the king's son-in-law. And so the lineage of Jesus starts out relevant to this other man who wasn't going to be distinguished as he was winning the popularity contest. There was something about him that before he even got the king's presence, people already knew. It was something that God was doing in him that distinguished him amongst everyone else. And with that, understand in our lives, that's the same thing. It doesn't matter how good a start you had, because the other person he's making him relative to is Abraham. Abraham had a real good start, but there was still something unique about Abraham that set him apart from others. And so the thing that we're seeing in the origin story of Jesus, whether you got a great start, not so great a start, or anything in between, it's the character that God is trying to develop in you that will be seen brightly, as we say in contrast. I tell that story all the time about the last time I spilled a whole bunch of water going out of the building. It was when it was real dark, it was coming out relatively late, and I thought I could walk out without light. And I said, yeah, that wasn't a good idea after I had a whole bunch of water to mop up on the floor out there. And I said, even if I had just a candle in that situation, it's going to contrast a whole lot. I'm going to appreciate that candle a whole lot more than I would in this room where it's well lit. And that is what you are in any situation you find yourself in. See, my temptation is to find myself in a bad situation, want to run out to something that feels better, more comfortable. It's just a better environment. But understand the purposes of God are sometimes seen better in situations where you have the strength to not be like everybody else in a situation where it ain't the best fit for you, right? But you're still showing something in God through you that he can use to tell the story from perspective that he is trying to tell it. And so Matthew's perspective is helping us understand who he is as a king. Going on, Mark, however, is going to start out in a different place. Now, a lot of folks read from Mark, so I appreciate when our brother read from Mark some this morning, right? Understanding that Mark gets right down to business. He doesn't give us genealogies. He starts writing, John the Baptist said he was coming. Here he is. And the thing you notice more about Jesus in the Gospel of Mark is his influence. And a lot of what I do as a preacher is I just translate, not so much terms it's already in English, I translate it into culture. And so we know a lot about influence because being an influencer is a big thing right now. It was a biblical thing back then. And that's what Mark seems to emphasize. The influence of his life on the people around him and the way in which he was. We talked in the young adults class. The question I have as a person is, as I make my decisions, as I choose my way and how I'm going to go about living my life, am I one, as Paul talked about in his ministry, am I one, reconciling myself to God? And then two, is my influence having that same effect on other people? Because Paul described himself as having the ministry of reconciliation. So it's by the time you get to the Beatitudes in Matthew 7, he's going to say, blessed are the peacemakers, right? Blessed are those people who have the power to go into a situation and God willing create some reconciliation in an otherwise difficult, peaceful, or not so peaceful environment. Got a chance to talk to Tom about that. On Friday, we were talking about de-escalation, right? I had to offer another one of my apologies. I was on one of my rants. And then I come upstairs and I see Tom's truck. Good night, here I go. Tom, sorry about that. Tom was gracious enough to tell me a story about one of his last blow-ups. And there we go. Talking about his experience in work before he retired, having to do some reconciliation. I was like, that's so weird because I'm about to talk about Matthew 7 or Matthew 5. I can't remember. Whatever chapter it was in the Sermon on the Mount, where that whole reconciliation was a big thing in what Jesus was talking about at that point. So he's talking about, blessed are the peacemakers. It's one of the things he values in people as a skill set. It's easy to fight, especially if you think you're going to win, right? As guys, we talked about sometimes guys aren't necessarily the ones who are noted when you think of who's kind. Tom said, wasn't a whole lot of guys who came to mind right away. That's because as men, we tend to walk around in our strength a little more than we probably should, right? And so in life, because we can sometimes create some messes that require some peacemaking, value is placed upon those who can make peace. Because as long as I think I'm capable as a man, my natural temptation is to break stuff, right? And so with that, God is saying you're not blessed when you're functioning in your power. Anybody can do that. Blessed are those who can put it back together again once we've given into the temptation to break stuff. So with that, Luke is going to go on after we talk about Christ's influence being one of healing and reconciliation. Luke is going to be more like what we talk about when you go into one of those menus, and as an old guy, I told the young people, one of the first lessons I had to learn, or maybe most lingering lessons I've had to learn as an old guy, is how to stay in my lane, my old folks' lane. And one of the things I learned about later on being an old guy is the off-menu selections you can go into some of these restaurants and get. They've been a big thing. Because I always go in, can I get this and that? And every now and again you see somebody come up and order. I'm like, where's that on the menu? That's off menu. And so, right, if you know, you understand that there's the menu you get, and then there's a whole lot of other blessings that are there if you just know how to ask the right questions. Luke, from my perspective right now, my theory on these Gospels is Luke looks a whole lot like that off-menu selection you get if you just know the right questions to ask. because he's going to have an extended section of teaching. Even though the Sermon on the Mount is going to be a foundational teaching from Matthew, Luke is going to have a whole lot more stories that are going to be that kind of deeper insight you get as an individual. Yeah, you understand, you're supposed to be righteous, you're supposed to seek first the kingdom of God, but in terms of your practical daily life, there are some deeper off-menu lessons you might want. If you want your life to really start looking, as opposed to kind of a hazy picture of the Christ, like Brother Titus said, whose image is that? Mufasa, right? If you really want to start looking like him, it's going to be in those off-menu lessons that you begin to develop a keener sense of what God actually looks like projected in your life before we even begin to open our mouths. And with that, I left out John because that's the non-synoptic gospel. That's the last one, right? The one that follows a completely different timeline. Why? Because in the beginning, it ain't his lineage. It's not John the Baptist. In the beginning, there was the Word, and the Word was with God. So he starts in a completely different place. And guess what? He ends up in a different place too. Because as opposed to the Great Commission in Matthew where we are, he's going to have to do some restoration, like we said, peacemaking. And the peacemaking you see at the end of John's Gospel, it's not the peacemaking between two folks who are at odds. It's the peacemaking between Christ and one of his friends who betrayed him. It's the restoration of Peter. So he helps you see that we're in beginning in a very different place, the very beginning of the whole story, the creation of the world, and then ending in a place of restoration with somebody who actually betrayed him. He is showing you a different perspective altogether than the synoptic gospels. And that's all I'm going to leave it right now. That's my theory. I preach this another 3 years down the line. I might be in a different place. But God willing, it's a foundation for understanding the Gospels right now as we look at Matthew chapters 1 through 7. Anyway, it's like Micah said. When I just named it Micah, I knew we were in trouble. I'm just going to preach these questions on the study guide. Maybe you pick one up. Hopefully we're going to keep it organized and talk about the kingdom in a way that will equip you to see some things about the way in which Matthew presents the kingdom. And hopefully God will, as we say from time to time, give you a deeper perspective on Christ, but on what he wants out of the reconciliation between us and him. First question we got in the study guide. From its origins before David, how esteemed did the line of David seem to be? Reading it out loud, that doesn't read very good. Anyway, we talked about it a little bit already. Was David somebody to really be known before? He didn't think so of himself. But sometimes my self-esteem is way lower than my reality. Let's read the first 6 verses of Matthew 1 to see if David was just being too self-deprecating. Verse 1, Matthew 1, the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, by who? Tamar. Pause, we'll come back there. Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, right? And then Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father, I missed one, sorry. And Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. Why do you think I paused on those few? He ain't mentioning everybody's wife, as we said in the New Testament. So why is he mentioning those? I told him that there sometimes I've had to get comfortable going into job interviews, embracing the downside of my history, my resume or whatever. Why? Because it's there. And it can either just be this awkward space or silence or this thing I'm trying to talk around. I can just own it. You think I thought that on my own? Or did I look at this lineage and realize Tamar was a woman who, in order to have her father-in-law honor her properly after his son, her husband, died, she went about it in a very non-conventional way. I see some faces. Y'all know the story. I'm going to say it. She pretended to be Rahab. Y'all know Rahab. She pretended to be Rahab and got impregnated by her father-in-law. That's not a part of the family tree everybody would emphasize. It's not one that I think Luke necessarily emphasizes. God didn't have to bring him through this line at all, but it doesn't end there. Because we got Rahab. Y'all know the story of Rahab? We got kids in the room. Good, I don't have to be rude. Then we got the story of Tamar. Tamar. No, we already did Tamar. I'm sorry. The story of Ruth. Oh, she gets the whole book. They're laughing, right? We talked about this in the adults class. Who are Ruth's people? Who? God, y'all said it already. Say it, please. The Moabites. Who are the Moabites? Enemies of Israel, but they had to start somewhere. Where'd they start? Abraham, and he had a nephew that traveled with him by the name of Lot. And Lot, we said they had first world problems. God blessed them with so much so quickly that they couldn't share the same space. Their hired servants started fighting over, we got too much stuff. Good problems to have, right? But they had to decide how they're going to divide up the land. And so one of the good things about Abraham is he seems to, much like David, I don't want to go too far in the story, but he seems to be a sacrificial man. Why? Because he was the one who got the promise, but he gave his nephew first choice over the land so that they could have peace. And so understand that's the line of Jesus. But what happens is Lot picks because of how good the land looks as opposed to a character assessment of the people there. He didn't do his background checks. Bottom line is he ended up camping near a good land that was in the region of, y'all know, Sodom and Gomorrah. Location, location, location. And so by the time Lot lives there for a while, he's making good money. I would translate it to say he's doing well. He's still got the blessing. But he's living in an environment where he can't enjoy all the stuff the way that it seems Abraham is. That's why God's telling us we have to look more deeply than just nice stuff. That's a lot of what Jesus is saying by helping us to understand. The way that Lot gets in trouble is now he's got to pick up and relocate because God's going to level it. And when he gets to leveling, Lot's got to go. But his sons-in-law, they don't believe. And so what happens is they stay behind. But likewise, his wife was, when they're born, don't even look back, y'all. She looks back. And so now he and his daughters are single. How do you suppose they decided it would be best to go ahead and get their kids? You know the story. I don't have to be crude. That's Ruth's people. Right? And so these are not the kinds of relationships you would necessarily emphasize, I'm going to speak for me, in my family tree. But God is embracing not only that part of the family tree, but the fact that he put him in that line anyway. By the time we get to Philippians, Paul is bragging about his lineage. Part of the thing he's talking about as a Pharisee of Pharisees, of the line of Benjamin. And Benjamin boys can scrap. That's how the story goes. And so he's for all lack of a better term, he's a nerd now. He's still proud of that. Right? And so now what we're seeing is a situation where Jesus isn't brought into any of that. He's brought in a situation where David is like, me? Married to the king's daughter. Okay. And Jesus is coming through a line. Those are the things they're emphasizing about his upbringing. The bottom line is, how does that have anything to do with in the kingdom? Hold on, I forgot the question now. Oh yeah, not a whole lot. Bottom line is, as we said before, we already really pretty much made that point. It's not the origin, it's what you do with that. And that's what we're going to see as we move on to chapter 2. What's the question about chapter 2? What contrast do you notice between King Herod and Christ the King? Well, chapter 2 is going to talk about after his lineage and the birth that we see at the second half of chapter 1. We're then going to go see the response. So it's Matthew's own version of what's his influence. And much like the story of David, anytime God begins to bless you with things, you're going to typically see two reactions. You're going to see that first reaction, all the applause. Oh my goodness, right? If it's great, some people are going to applaud. Oh, but then there's like the aftertaste, right? There's the aftertaste of success. And that's what we see in chapter 2. Because wise men are going to come. We heard the Messiah is about to be born. We saw his star. No, the star comes later. Anyway, we saw signs that the Messiah was going to be born. Double check me on that. The star comes later. But the bottom line is word gets out and Herod gets uneasy. So does all Jerusalem. And so the upside is there are people coming from what seems to be far and wide to see the birth of the king. But there's already a king there. Yeah, and he's not, no. The bottom line is this. When chapter 2, what we'll start to see is the distinction between two kings. Why God even needed to replace the kings in Israel at that time in the first place. Understand that he never said, he said there was going to be a king that came through the line of David, but they didn't have to go into captivity. We talked about it before. There are times in my life when my decisions will lead me to a place of regret. And it's just easier for me to pretend like, well, it was going to be like this anyway, instead of owning the fact that I made some decisions that made this a much rougher path than it had to be. That's what's happening here. And so by the time Herod is king, he wasn't in the line of David. How did he end up being king? Well, they made so many mistakes. The Romans took over, and they started putting whoever they wanted in as king. And so now Jesus Christ is threatened by somebody who never should have been in that position in the first place, and he is having to deal with the fact that that person is now trying to kill him. And the lesson that we see in these two kings is he is prophesied as a king who was going to, by the time we get to verse 6, when it's talking about the prophecies about him, they told him when Herod was trying to find out, okay, well, where is he to be born? Because I want to worship him too. He's going to say, in Bethlehem of Judea, so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Backing up to verse 2. It's literally going to say, where is he who was to be born king? That was from the wise men. And understand that whole part about he is going to shepherd my people Israel is a super interesting contrast to what Herod had become. Because as you know the story, as things progress and as he realizes he was not able to capture the Christ, what's his plan B? What's his plan B? Kill them all. Kill everybody in that region around his age. And the thing to realize about the distinction between the shepherd, the part of his character that God is trying to emphasize, and the parts of just ungodliness that God is trying to weed out of Israel at this point, is the fact that Herod looks at his people, his sheep, like widgets. You know what widgets are? I wish I didn't, but in college or in economics, when they were teaching us about money, they're talking about business. These aren't your personal finances. These are the factors that companies consider when they're deciding what to do and how to make money. And sometimes their factors are money. Sometimes their factors are equipment. Sometimes their factors are people. But the bottom line is they're all just widgets. And in situations where you are not genuinely cared for, you become a widget to the people over you. Let me say, I don't need to say it again. Y'all get it. Because I think we're in a real world where we all had some suspect jobs. I've said it before. If you, in your resume, if you got nothing but stars, gold 5-star ratings, or the places you work, that you decide on the places you work, sometimes I say, I salute you. Praise God that somebody's had that work history. But for the rest of us, we appreciate the good because we've been through the thank you. And so you've been in places where you've been treated like a widget, I'm guessing. And you understand, even if you haven't, if you got family, you can't put together a whole family where nobody worked in a place where they weren't treated like an object. We call it objectification. And that's what these sheep were to Herod. They were simply something to use to make sure he was able to keep his position and his comfort. And the flip side is the very reason that Christ came, the contrast that we're seeing in this telling of the gospel, is the kingdom is not about sheep helping me build my empire. It's me sacrificing to make that reconciliation with God possible. And so that's why when you see Abraham as an example of somebody who was willing to sacrifice his property just to have peace, you see David, one of the things we see in David as a man after God's own heart, we talked about that whole question before of with David. Why was David so special? Well, by the time we get to the Sermon on the Mount, he's going to talk about, after we talk about the whole concept of tremendous promise, ask, seek, knock, because everybody who asks gets, right? Everybody seeks will find. Knocking the door will be open. Is that a blank check? No, it's not a blank check. Because the whole rest of the chapter, as we descend the plane on the Sermon on the Mount, it talks about there are two paths. There's the straight path and the broad. The straight path leads to life. It's not so easy. Broad, do it however you want. It doesn't lead to a place you actually want to ever get to. Beyond walking that path, you have to make a decision. How am I going to go about doing my life? How am I going to go about living life? Because it's one thing, as we said, I don't want to rehash an illustration, but I will because I don't have a better one yet. Life of David. David could have simply looked at his father's call to tend sheep when his brothers were off getting glory in battle, and be like, this job is beneath me. I've been anointed a king. When Samuel came in here, he passed by, they left me out where I'm usually at. And the prophet made sure they called me in and anointed me king. I'm done with these sheep. And so his path to the kingdom, to the throne, was embracing a job that wasn't so glorious. But there's a difference between me embracing the path that goes through some jobs I might not like so much, and me getting there and in the young adult class. All my waking thoughts are about the job I want as opposed to the job I got. How effective do you think I'm going to be getting my job done right now if all I'm doing is dreaming? And that's the difference between choosing the right way. That's right, Dad. I'll go out and tend those sheep and just getting out there daydreaming while the lions and the bears are just picking them off. Right? And so David chose not to drag his feet because more than picking the right way, yes, I'll be a shepherd. He chose to do his job the right way. And both matter. And that's literally how he's going to end up the Sermon on the Mount. But before he gets there, he's going to talk about this whole concept in, was it question 2? Part of the thing that distinguished Herod from Christ was the fact that he simply looked at the sheep as a means to an end. They were nothing more than a widget in his operation. As opposed to the Christ who in the line of David. David didn't just decide he was going to be obedient to the call to be a shepherd boy when even after he'd been anointed king. He wasn't just obedient to the way he should get the job done. He went another level. And he was out there, and most of us have a line, like there's a too far, there's a too much, I love this job, but I got a life to live. Most people would not risk their life fighting lions and bears over sheep. That's who David was. And when we're emphasizing him being part of the lineage of Christ, starting it off, he's basically saying that's the attitude of the Christ toward the sheep, as opposed to Herod, who's willing to kill. And here's the thing. It seems extreme. Most of us, if we were Herods, we might not get to trying to genocide, right? But here's the thing. If he's willing to kill kids, what do you think he'd do to you? And so in less strained or stressful environment, if he's willing to kill the most vulnerable people in the society, what's he willing to do to you more low-key? Because that's how most of our battles are played out in real life. Let's take this out of the perspective of the story. Most of our battles are played out in situations where we have to trust who people are beyond the smiles, right? And so low-key, when you see a situation like this, when you're starting to get red flags in the life of people, that people to them are just widgets. The question really becomes at some point, wait a minute, I'm people too. And at what point does the widget become me? And so that's what we're seeing in the Gospels early on. We're seeing the distinction. He's giving you some red flags. For times when I had a friend who was super wise when I was working for the federal government. I was like, bro, you just won a trial. You just won that trial and this and that. You already leaving? He was like, yeah. The only reason I've been able to stay around in the federal government for this long is every time I get, can't say a word, I get a certain kind of alert about the kind of character that I'm dealing with. And whenever I get that alert, I get to moving. That guy had been in the federal government for years, but didn't necessarily stick around very long unless he found places where he trusted the character of the people leading him. And I learned real well from his wisdom and insight, not even from a biblical perspective, that what he saw early on, all the rest of us were about to learn. He got it when the getting was good. So the rest of us had to learn the hard way. Going on in chapter 3, the question we'll talk about in chapter 3. What similarities do there seem to be between John the Baptist and the Christ? And this is one where I pretty much just need to read the passages, because in life, one of the great things is the realization, as our brothers have been talking about from time to time, grace is an important concept, but it's an even more important concept when I have some substance behind it. And so by the time we get to the later chapters, chapter 11 maybe, John the Baptist is going to be taken into custody pretty quick after he starts giving the Pharisees an earful. The very next chapter, chapter 4, is going to talk about how he's taken into custody, but he doesn't get killed until later. And so one of the things that we see, sorry about that. later on in the life of John the Baptist, there were some things that even after he was locked up, there were some things that he said that the Christ was going to be like, yep, check, that's pretty good, yep, check, yep, check. So Jesus is going to be quoting some of the things that John is saying, some lesser known sayings in his teaching. And one of the things in my life that I appreciate is even beyond my mistakes. Sometimes y'all might fact check me like, that's not completely right. Shoot me an email, give me a call. And hopefully, God willing, if it's wrong, I'll correct it. But the good thing is, hopefully, my perspective towards being corrected will still preserve the credibility of my teaching. Because it's one thing I've said before, to try to take on the mantle of trying to be perfect. I don't make mistakes, and I get super defensive when you suggest that I did. That's too heavy a burden to carry, right? And so in the life of John from prison is going to send messengers to Jesus Christ. They're like, wait a minute, are you the one? Or should we look for somebody else? Because I think John, much like the others, were expecting this whole kingdom thing to look a whole lot different than it did. And so by the time John has already baptized him, he's like, I can't baptize you. You should baptize me. That's this chapter 3. But life takes him out into some places where he starts doubting. And Jesus is going to gently rebuke him and be like, amongst those born of woman, there's none greater than this guy. But the least in the actual kingdom of God or kingdom of heaven is greater than he, because he's helping us to understand there are levels to our understanding. And we don't have to be perfect in our existence now in order to still have God give us a lot of confirmation. And that's what we're going to see, because we're going to see in John's ministry. Because even though he's going to make some pretty significant mistakes later on, or at least one, in his doubt and his lack of faith in the Christ, by the time you get to chapter 3, there are going to be some key things that he's going to say that Jesus is going to pretty much parrot and endorse. Verse 1 of chapter 3, in those days, John the Baptist came preaching in the wilderness of Judea. Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Wait, lo and behold, chapter 4, verse 17, after Jesus has been tempted in the wilderness, it's going to say, verse 17, from that time Jesus began to preach, saying, repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. All right, that's simple enough. However, keep going. In that same section back in chapter 3, John's going to keep saying some things. He is going to welcome the crowds as they come out to him to be baptized, but he's going to pause in verse 7 when he sees the Pharisees. He's going to be like, wait a minute, why are y'all really here? I paraphrase, but the text is going to say, but when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees coming to his baptism, he said to them, you brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? Jesus is going to be like, no, John, you're a little bit too harsh there. No, he's not. Because in chapter 12, after he has begun to have extended period of conflict with maybe not that same region, but some of that same collective, it is going to say in verse 33, when he's talking about healthy speech, either make the tree good and its fruit good, or make the tree bad and its fruit bad. For the tree is known by its fruit. You brood of vipers, how can you speak good when you are evil? For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And so John's okay, maybe I didn't do anything right, but thank God I'm giving him some things as the one who is preparing the way for him that are helping the work that he has, God willing, in the hearts of those who are willing to hear. It doesn't stop there, because in verse 9 of chapter 3, it's going to say, and do not presume to say to yourselves that we have Abraham as our, back up to verse 8, please. Bear fruit in keeping with repentance. Famous parable famous passage that we're going to get to see in the Sermon on the Mount. Why? Because as he's closing it out with some of those passages that are helping us to understand, okay, which way are we going to go and how are we going to go about living in that way? Chapter 7, roundabout, verse 17 is going to say, so every healthy tree bears good fruit, as he is distinguishing between those who are saying or doing productive things and the false prophets. He's going to continue on back in chapter 3 of Matthew, around about verse 9. And do not presume to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. For I tell you, God's able from these stones to raise up children for Abraham. Even now the axe is laid at the root. And every tree, therefore, that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. John, you have gone too far. You're preaching angry. Ultimately, Jesus is going to say the same thing back in chapter 7. If we continue on, he is going to say in verse 19, every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits. That's the way Christ is going to start to end the Sermon on the Mount. And then finally, in John chapter 3, verse 12, it's going to say, his winnowing fork is in his hand, and he will clear his threshing floor, gather his wheat into the barn. So he will crisp a threshing floor and gather his wheat into barn, but the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire. Pointing forward to Matthew chapter 13. Matthew chapter 13, where Jesus, in his famous discussion that really goes in the form of parables, he's going to tell them why he speaks to them in parables, and he's going to explain the parables to those who are looking for those deeper lessons. As we mentioned before, the off-menu items, he's going to explain to his apostles what the parable of the weeds means. And in explaining the parable of the weeds, he's going to pick up around verse 39, saying of Matthew 13. Let's back up. And the enemy who sowed them, that is the weeds, is the devil. The harvest is the close of the age, and the reapers are angels. Just as the weeds are gathered and burned with fire, so will be at the close of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all causes of sin and all lawbreakers, and throw them into the fiery furnace, in that place where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It shouldn't be the least bit bouncy in the way that I read that, but it goes back to literally what John was warning about in verse 12, where he is going to, once again, burn the chaff with unquenchable fire. And where does that leave grace? Where does it leave grace? Well, the whole part about grace is as he approaches the Sermon on the Mount, he is, after his baptism in chapter 3, he's going to be led out into the wilderness, as we have talked about. One of the realities or real things that you see in your times of life is not only will the enemy attack you when you're weak, 40 days and 40 nights of fasting in the wilderness, but it's after you've had your period of relief. Baptism, just as his words were going to be an encouragement to John the Baptist, wouldn't it be great after your baptism, you got out of the water, and Jesus and God said, this one stuck. I don't know, something add in, right? He just put some kind of endorsement on your baptism, just a little bit of extra. Well, I don't deserve it. I don't need that. But as encouraging as it would be, that's what Jesus got. But guess what he also got after the encouragement? It's what we also in life often get after our wins. It's a huge trial. And so a lot of times in life, especially, it's one thing if I just had a win, full of energy, and overcame. But he was dragged out into a place where for 40 days and 40 nights he was enduring. And then he overcame, right? And even before that, realize his life to that point was he couldn't even get settled in around his playmates in Bethlehem because his family, they were basically refugees in Egypt, right? And so they had to wait to be called, because the prophecy literally says, out of Egypt I will call my son. They had to be called out of Egypt so he could go back to the place he was supposed to reign over, right? So understand that this young man's life started bumpy. It wasn't his history and his lineage, but it seems like it started out rough. Why? Because when they come back, he finds out that Herod isn't the king anymore, but the son is. And so it's not safe to just move anywhere. And so there are times in life where you got your ambition set to move. We got the whole land out before us, don't we? You want to be real careful where you set up your tent. And so that level of discretion in Joseph, his earthly father, led them to pick a less better part of town, but it was safe from the ones who might have still wanted him dead. And so understand life, it's the same thing. You got the world laid out before you. You got options set out. We are all going to have to deal with those lot choices. We're all going to have to deal with those times after I've been deprived enough. I've been running for a while. I'm tired. I just want an easy choice. Understand, those are the times when the enemy attacked the Christ, and you can expect those to be the times when the enemy attacks you as well. David, what were David's dangers? Immediately after, Goliath, not long after that, he was a fugitive because of the backlash of the success. The Christ, in the same circumstance, overcame the attempts on his life as a child, overcame the stress of, as the later Gospels will talk about, super wise as a kid, what we would call a prodigy, but he's still growing up in Nazareth. And after all of that, going out to the wilderness, finally, sorry, I'm in the story out of order. After growing up in a place not many people would say, yeah, I can see the most likely to achieve coming out of there. No, I can see the most likely to achieve coming out of that background. No. Ultimately, what happened was after he finally gets his break, here comes Satan. And so understand, those are the times in life when I still have to pray to God. Because one of the things, there's a new King David movie. I haven't watched it yet. I got a flag to watch. And sometimes one of the things I notice in those movies is I'm watching the promo. I'm like, do I really want to watch this? Because a lot of these, I'm a Jesus person. I can't say I'm proud of all the Jesus entertainment we got out there. Sometimes it's just cheesy. But I'm watching this promo. And one of the things that caught me about it was when David was talking to his brothers, or whoever it was he was talking to about going out to face Goliath. He talked about just a really simple statement. Doesn't matter what I can do because God is the one who's going to provide the victory. And it sounds cheesy because I'm not saying the line right, but for whatever reason, watching that promo, that struck me as something I'm a little bit more interested in watching. The reason why that connects with me is because, God willing, how we're going to try to go ahead and land this plane. Let's get chapter 4, because the things that he was doing to establish the kingdom, you'll see in the very end of chapter 4, where he's talking about beyond teaching in verse 23, and beyond proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom once again, he's healing people. He's healing people. And so I'm not going to ever be able to heal the way that Jesus did. I can't even heal the way our doctors do. But the bottom line is this. I can look after some sick folk because when Paul is asked what true religion is, he says, it's preaching a super good sermon this Sunday, Marcus. It's persuading 50 people to get baptized this week. True religion is it, the widow and the fatherless, right? Right? Look after them, right? And so the question is, beyond what Jesus was saying, the things that he was doing were all about what the kingdom was about, how he was laying the foundation of his kingdom. And so beyond that, when you go to the actual Sermon on the Mount, I got no time left for Sermon on the Mount. Chapter 5, I looked at it from the perspective of attitudes. It's called Beatitudes. That doesn't mean he's talking about attitudes, but it's the whole concept of what's my attitude towards three things. What's my attitude towards life? Do I really think I'm blessed when I'm poor in spirit? I'm trying to save as much as I can. That's not the poverty he's talking about. I drew on the example of the woman who was not embarrassed to come into a party. It seemed like a gathering she wasn't invited to cry her tears on his feet and wipe them with her hair. And lo and behold, sometimes I can do some things, I can be super self-conscious. I mean, everybody saw that, or everybody's going to treat me odd or different because of that. Everybody thinks the less of me. But in this situation, they really did. And Jesus knew what they were thinking. And he said, Simon, to the one who had invited him in but was looking down on the woman, I came in and you didn't offer me any of the things that she's doing in ways of kindness and courtesy. So he told him a parable about who really loves more, the one who was forgiven much or the one who was forgiven little. And even Simon got it, the one who was forgiven much. And he talks about this woman who had been forgiven a whole lot. She had a level of gratitude that Simon, looking down on her, could not relate to. And here's the thing. We're saying blessed are the poor in spirit. We're blessing, or we're saying, I can't say it. This is once again, be a Berean. Double check me on this. Blessed are those who realize I can't fix it myself. And it's one thing for me to say I can't fix it myself and then I go into a tantrum and I get mad because as a man I like to act in my power, right? And so now I'm starting to feel less manly. And so now I'm starting to feel inadequate. And there are times if I'm not careful, I'm starting to lash out on people I can get away with lashing out on down the rabbit hole. But if I'm the only one, I'm just the only one, right? Okay? But if I'm not, understand, these are ways as men that we are tempted to lash out when we feel inadequate. He is saying, blessed are you when you, even as a man, aren't so ashamed of your inadequacy that you begin to emotionally break down. But you believe what Paul said, when I am weak, then I am strong. You start to look at the exposure of your legitimate weaknesses as an opportunity for God to go in and build you up in ways, I say it all the time, it's a cliche, building up a strength I never would have had on my own. And so blessed am I. Why is that? Because out of all these Beatitudes, he's literally going to say, blessed are the poor in spirit, chapter 5, verse 3, for theirs is the... So when we're talking about the kingdom, some of these he's literally linking to if you can get this, then you get what the kingdom is about. It's beyond humility. It's allowing God to repair you in places where you're weak, to where you no longer view it as a weakness. You view it as, we say from time to time, an opportunity for God to build you up. You're not, like you said, I don't have to say it again, lashing out at others or just angry with yourself. Sometimes not lashing out at others. Sometimes I get into a vicious cycle where I begin to live beneath my potential because I begin to say, I can't do it. I can't do it. That's not for me. I've said before, that's for other people. And it's not the other person I'm lashing out on. I get in a downward spiral of lashing out at myself and living beneath my potential because I'm so ashamed of my failures and my weaknesses. He's saying, blessed are you when you can embrace your weaknesses to the point where you get God in to let the shame go and allow him to finally help you reach your potential. It's not just that. He said, understand that much like we saw in the life of David and even Christ at this point, blessed are you in verse 10 when you are, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of God. And so there are times when I get in my mode and I just want to break, like we said before. I'm not expecting the enemy to personally come and offer me a challenge when I finally get a break. We said to describe spiritual warfare. He doesn't fight fair. He wants to find me on Saturday. He wants me when I'm resting. He wants me in times when I should reasonably be able to expect a break because life's been mean enough already. That doesn't move him, right? And so in times when rightfully culture tells the reward for what I've just done should be a pat on the back, blessed are those for whom when you've done right, and it's literally because you're doing the things that God has called you to do, you start looking at those attacks not from the perspective of, woe is me, but wait a minute, that's literally what Jesus and David, and by the time you get to Hebrews chapter 11, the Faith Hall of Fame, nobody, can I give one sports analogy? I've already preached 20 minutes over, so maybe, okay, I'm sorry. Maybe it'll get the sermon done quicker. Nobody mounts a defense against the people on the bench. Right? And so when you're playing a sport or you're doing anything and you're getting resistance, you know that's a natural sign that you're actually in the game. And so that is one of the things that he is trying to help us understand. We get it in sports. But sometimes, this is what my life was before I actually started trying to sacrifice the love for God. I actually was sitting there, it was either Sunday or a class, and they were going through things like this, and I think I've told y'all this before. I was like, ain't none of that happening in my life, so what am I really doing? Ouch. That hit my life in a place where it needed to change. And over time, I understood sports, and I realized I was sitting on the bench. And that's why things were going. Ain't nobody's life perfect, but they were going relatively well. Oh, but I got up off the bench. And all these things, they didn't have to be lessons no more. Now I'm running back to the word. I was like, now how did you say you deal with that? Because now I'm in the game. And so now what he's trying to help you to understand is to understand the signs that you are actually in the game in the way that God has called you to play it. And so that's how the sermon is going to end up, because after you're talking about change your attitude towards the challenges of life, change your attitude toward the law. Because Jesus is going to say, I've not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And so he's going to say, unless you understand the law really well, Old Covenant, you're not going to understand your New Covenant righteousness. Why? Because you have to be more righteous than the scribes and Pharisees. How are you going to understand how to be more righteous than them if you don't understand what they were called to do? And so that's why the Old Covenant was so important. And it's just as important now. See, I can have, like we said before, a vague image of what the Christ is supposed to look at. I got baptized. Or I can have a more definitive image. Look at it on your TV. If you get a TV from Brother Barry and all you're seeing is images, you can go talk to Brother Barry. Brother Barry, is this what this really supposed to look like? Because this got that A and that D on the box. And I don't, okay. And understand, God sees us the same way. See, sometimes I want a life that's so comfortable that all I bear is a hazy image of who he is. But just like I wouldn't be satisfied with an HD TV that came out in pixelated blocks, don't expect him to be happy with that image of him in Mufasa. Right? So understand, he's saying, please understand these deeper lessons of what I'm calling you to do, that are rooted in the law so you can understand who your righteousness has to exceed if you're really going to start to look like God. That's why he can't live it out in the first place, because he gave it to him in the form of rules, but they came out pixelated. And so in order to refine the picture, he lived it out for them. And that's why I'm giving the excuse that I'm this far past time and I'm still not shutting up. But chapter 6, we're almost done. Chapter 6, how is he challenging their motives? Because their motives were potentially defective in two ways. Once they decided that they were going to try to take on the image of Christ, I can be motivated by just being transformed in the image of Christ. But I've lived a life too. I need a pat on the back, especially when things have been tough. And he's saying, be careful of doing your righteous acts just so you can be seen by people. Be careful of giving to people just so you can be seen by people and get the praise. That has a certain level of praise that's much less than the praise that God is going to give. Be careful of praying. Oh, just praying. We don't do that anymore, thank God. But there was a time where I used to try to make my prayer sound Shakespearean. Right? Because that's what the New King James sounded like. And I wasn't being heard any more than I was when I actually decided to go actually give my life for God. That's what he's saying. Don't try to sound Shakespearean like you're impressing God. You'll get praise from people, but the praise from God is probably better. And then finally, fasting. Oh, man, there are those times I'm fasting. I want to tell people about it. Oh, I'm hungry. No, I'm sorry. That's not what you want to do. But you want the praise that comes from, I'm an extra good Christian now, aren't I? But he's saying, check those motives, because it's beyond just deciding that you want to follow God, to understand that you need to follow him for the right reasons, because the kingdom is all about the right attitude towards what he's calling us to do and the right motives. Because finally, your attitude and your motives are the foundation for what you actually do, and that's chapter 7. So in chapter 7, the kingdom is all about understanding, yes, you do serve and ask, seek, knock God. He is willing to do exceedingly and abundantly more than we ask or think, but understand that the bottom line is, who are you going to be to the people around you if you're serving a God who's that generous, who's that, as our brother said, that kind and that understanding? And that's the challenge I have. See, because the further away I move away from my own forgiveness, the easier it is for me to be really harsh on you when you make a mistake. And so that's the lesson that we'll see later on in the Gospel of Luke as I try to wind this down. As he's talking about the kingdom of God in a lot of ways is about not forgetting who you were in those moments when you really felt forgiven. See, because there are times, I think I'm pretty sure, I can just speak for myself, and I'm going to say one of the things that, in addition to us just all breathing air and drinking water, we have some common things, or some things in common. Life brings us all into a place, even if, like I said, I've never been a soldier, but into a place where we all relate to that whole concept of foxhole confessions. The one thing we have in life is we're living in a world that is much larger than any of us. And if we don't, the word literally says, if we don't humble ourselves, he will humble us. And if I can raise in my life, like Ebenezer they raised as they were going into the promised land, if I could firmly affix in my heart that time when I was so desperate to be forgiven, or as one of my buddies, friend from growing up, he's doing, name dropping now, but he's doing really well. He's a Christian entertainer, and he talks about his marriage often as a metaphor for his growth. He grew up a preacher's kid. Definitely didn't want to be a preacher, even though that's the way he was being directed, and so he went into Christian entertainment. And he talks about one of the things that happened when he and his wife had separated for a time. He was absolutely convinced he wanted a divorce. He went back to mom and daddy's house. Daddy knew what was going on. He said, you can stay here for a night, but you got to go fix that, right? Which set the stage for him being like, I'm not going back. So he got a different place for a while, but as he was finally finding his footing in his career, he realized that he was sitting in Miami. Brother, if you listen to this, please forgive me for telling the story wrong. In Miami, when his career was finally taking off, around all this temptation, if you haven't been to Miami, but realizing even if he was tempted by what he was seeing around him, it wouldn't feel the same. Because the person who had been with him all those years wasn't any longer in his life. And he appreciated the fact that his success was not going to feel right unless he reconciled to the person who he probably had a legitimate grudge against at that time. But the thing that God convicted him with, as he was trying to decide whether or not he was going to let go of that grudge, is, I think he said two things. One, I didn't condemn you for what you did, and you know you did as a preacher's kid. And I didn't expose you for what you did. And to this day, would cause you trouble in all this you're trying to build. And at that point, knocking on the door and hugging his wife got a whole lot easier because God reminded him of all that he had been forgiven of. And as my friend tells that story now, my prayer for us is this, is that we remember that point in our life where God neither condemned or exposed us as we have to go forward. And when he's teaching them how to pray, forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Because if you forgive, you will be. But if you don't forgive, if we don't take anything else out of the first 7 chapters of Matthew, please raise in us, God, a significant enough memory, not just a mental memory, but an emotional memory of what it is that you bailed me out of so that I can forgive the way you have called me to forgive, so that I can have the ministry, like Paul said, the ministry of reconciliation, not just for me, but for God willing, all people, you give me the ability in life and in action, influence, as we together stand and sing.